Good afternoon. I'm Jeannette Wing. In case you didn't notice, I apparently was on the schedule this morning. I was supposed to make some introductory remarks about the Data Science Institute at Columbia University. So I am the head of the Data Science Institute at Columbia. I'm relatively new to Columbia. And I just wanted to say that it's just a pleasure for me to be here when I see data science and big data and all sorts of data mining techniques being used for financial prediction, market prediction, and so on. I think this is really great. I also think it's nice to see news and finance come together. I understand that this is the first of the 3 conferences where fake news has been so prominently discussed, and that is actually going to be one of the questions for my panelists. So I understand also, and I'm glad I was here for Charles's panel, that I don't have to introduce the panelists because you can read about them in your booklet. So we have Thanos, Alessandro, Peter, and Tsveta. And what I thought I would first share with you the kinds of questions that are burning on my mind that I wanted to ask the panelists to address. First, it's, what kinds of news or news information do you use in your own company or for your clients? And because of such prominence of fake news today, how has fake news affected your approach for your company? The second question is more about what sources of information, perhaps not just news articles, but in addition to news articles, do you use in making these kinds of analyses, doing these kinds of analyses? And if we have time, we can talk more about, and this is now the technologist in me, curious, what sorts of new technologies or new tools are you actually using to do this kind of prediction using these kinds of data sources? So what I like the panelists to do is first address the first question, and we'll start with Thanos, go down the row, and I will absolutely save time for audience questions. So.
All right, well, we collect everything almost, from water reports from reservoirs to...
Well, so one thing I think would be helpful for the audience is, before you start answering my question, is just to introduce yourself and say the context of your company, where you're coming from, what who your clients are, just to get level set.
Fair enough. So I work for RBC Capital Markets, and they have actually, since they make their money not from the news, they typically have very little interest in collecting news until it's too late. And our clients are typically, in my group, which is our research and development, either the investment bank, and they want us to investigate who they're going to invest their money in, or it will be the technology department who will want to know where the market's going in terms of technology, in terms of employment workforce. It can be the commodities who are very sensitive to a lot of sources of news, from, as I was going to say, water supplies. And it can be compliance and security, who are very sensitive about the brand name and the reputation of the bank and the members of the bank. So we've got to collect data from everywhere. Now, my group never really had a clear mandate, but I kind of decided that we would collect almost everything we could get our hands on. And our sources are Telegram, Pastebin, Reddit, Twitter, not so much Facebook, it's hard to get anything out of them, but all the news sources we can get from Reuters feeds and Bloomberg feeds, and papers published by academia, and also local governments, almost obviously reports from corporations. So it's a whole gamut of data we collect, and we try to process it. We don't process all of it, but we're collecting it, and that's our first stage in the development of, let's say, a large news, or let's say information intelligence system for the bank. So that's basically it. Now, in terms of, did I cover all the questions?
Let's save the fake news question for a second.
Yes. Right.
Let's go to you.
Very good. So I work for Blackrock, and in particular for a group that is called Systematic Active Equities. So we are active in the sense that we try to exploit what the previous presenter, David, has called mispricings. We do equities mainly, and we do that in a very systematic way. And I wanted to stress that we are investors, because I think in many maybe previous editions of the conference, the focus was very often on trading, and we have seen Twitter, the Twitter paper this morning about getting ahead potentially of an event with alternative data of that you can exploit. Whereas for us, being investors, we answer the usual questions that also a fundamental investor would answer, that are, what are the companies with good fundamentals, good sentiment, or companies that are exposed to good macro themes? And while, say, 20 years ago, we are answering this question using accounting data, for example, nowadays this has completely changed. And the information that we use comes from news, for example, Bloomberg News, but also from broker reports, from conference call transcripts, central bank speakers' speeches. We are moving into audio recordings, video recordings of CEOs talking to analysts, social media. We use Twitter, we use Glassdoor, anything that can give us information about these three questions. And in terms of techniques, that's another good investment for us. Clearly, when you are dealing with data that is not the traditionally low-frequency accounting data, but is more, text, for example, the techniques that you need to use are very different. And we'll talk maybe about the techniques later in answering your third question. But I think one thing that I wanted to point out is that what you need to have is a very heterogeneous talent base in your group to be able to do this. And on one end, you have former finance academics that can do the easy job, and then you need computer scientists or natural language processing experts to do the hard stuff, all working together in the same room. And I think the difficult part is to invest in this in terms of applications. You can try to have applications for stock-specific ideas, as I was mentioning, but also if you're interested in macro, you can use the same data to try to answer macro questions. And this is probably the most challenging of all, because clearly the data that you can use are big, but then the macro quantities are not that many, and they are not as high frequency as you would like them to be.
Thank you.
I'm the chief data scientist at Ravenpack. We are not investors, but rather we are data providers. We operate in the big data analytics sphere, producing primarily, or historically, we have come from news analytics. We have expertise in natural language processing, so we sell what we turn unstructured content into a structured data feed, analytics that we sell into the quantitative hedge fund and asset management community. We have been around since 2003, and we turned commercial in 2007. So we have had a news analytics product for 10 years. As it kind of indicates already, talking about news analytics, primarily we are focusing on news and blogs, but we have also more recently turned our NLP capabilities on earnings transcripts and analyst reports, email and instant messages, and so on. So anything that comes in textual format. Our primary focus is for finance.
Very good. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I come from the Eurasia Group, and the Eurasia Group is a political risk shop. So for the past 20 years, we've tried to analyze the intersection of politics and real economies and markets. And we've tried to help various financial institutions and business leaders think through how various political events, or generally the political environment, provides a structure for various business activities. And again, for a lot of businesses and financial institutions, politics is something of a fat tail that they don't necessarily factor into their models. And so what we've tried to do is create narratives and indexes to help them in the process. So in terms of news, it's in some ways news provides a framework for our activities, as a lot of businesses and financial institutions are subject to an overwhelming amount of political events. And one of the challenge for them is to really figure out how much of the news is real news, as in signal, as having an event that has an impact on either the economy or in markets, and how much of news is entertainment. So one of our core goals is to exactly distinguish signal and noise to help our clients be less distracted, potentially, or to identify how political risk might have been mispriced. In the process, we tend to analyze both social media and mainstream media in addition to other types of data. And I think, as some of my fellow panelists already talked, the way we take news is very much in combination with other types of data. Macroeconomic data, political data, social data, and our emphasis has been on triangulation in order to make sure that the news that we consume is reliable and helps give us robust predictions. Maybe the final thing I want to mention at this point is that the way we have also leveraged news as a type of data is to analyze it in terms of what it can tell us and how it can help us predict various political events. So you can, for example, think about how you might use social media to forecast elections. We've also analyzed, we tried to use news to analyze various geopolitical events and relationships. So again, think very global economy, or a good example that's in the news these days is the North Korean crisis. And then finally, we've tried to use news about political events, geopolitical events, social events, and see how that relates to market performance.
Can you just give a couple of concrete examples of using news to predict or to analyze these geopolitical events?
Sure. So an experiment that we've run is taking news and looking at specific keywords that tell us where certain geopolitical tensions might be rising, whether they're concrete military tensions or nuclear tensions, and using these words in very much some of the same ways that the presenters in the earlier panels already discussed. We then constructed what we call a geopolitical risk index. And we have some results showing us that if, again, we focus on geopolitical events as those are the interstate relations that we think broadly as global security. So North Korea would be a good example, 9/11, the Iraq War, etc. But these big global events and conflicts. So if we construct an index around threats to those and the actual materialization of such events, that gives us leverage on understanding changes in GDP, stock returns, and even flows between economies. So that's an example of a geopolitical risk that we've constructed that's helped us understand economic outcomes. I'll give another quick example. Here we've leveraged both social media and news in trying to understand social unrest. And again, have similarly constructed a social unrest media index. And that index we found is helping us understand stock volatility.
Peter, you want to say something?
Yeah, so one of the things that we do, we detect entities and events in the news as well as sentiment. And we cover something like 250,000 entities, anything from companies to places, to organizations, and so on. And we have an event taxonomy that covers nearly 7,000 different types of events that span business, economy, political, societal, and environmental news. And we try to look at some of these.
This is worldwide.
Yeah, this is global, and we cover 19,000 sources. But one of the things that, the reason for why I kind of mentioned this is that we were trying to use you know, our event detection and entity detection capabilities for political risk. And in particular, we looked at the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and tried to plot that on a timeline, what it looked like. And we were leveraging, can you say, co-mentions, what you call co-mentions in the news, so entities that tend to appear together. And actually, what you saw across the various sources, that Russia and Ukraine were actually not mentioned very much in the news together before the conflict actually broke out. In fact, what you had of co-mention spikes for Ukraine were more related to IMF, talking about, you know, having a stable outlook. You saw co-mention volume spike. Then there were talks about, you know, official visits by IMF, and then you saw another spike downgrading the outlook for Ukraine, and then there were talks about bailouts. But when you saw the conflict between Russia and Ukraine break out, you saw massive spikes in co-mention volume, something like Russia taking up 40% of all co-mention volume for Ukraine. But you also saw massive spikes for European and for the US, European countries and for the US. But when you took a step deeper into what was driving the co-mention volume, you could see that for the US and for Europe, the events that we were detecting were much more passive in nature. So it was about analysts looking from outside and in, talking about economic guidance or sanction guidance and so on. But if you looked at the stories that co-mentioned Ukraine with Russia, it was about diplomatic recall, airspace violation, civil unrest, war conflicts, sanctioned targets, and so on. So using this type of data and using these type of analytics, you're able to create real-time geopolitical indicators that can highlight these conflicts.
Well, let me ask you this: now that given that you can do the analysis and we now know what that event was, did you go back and build a different model based on the deeper analysis? Because there, or did you actually have a prediction there that played out?
We didn't necessarily try to do a prediction. I was just trying to plot whatever our data said about this particular conflict. But we have had, can you say, we have done some work with Rubini Economics, where they also looked at our data and kind of had an economist independently say, okay, you are experts in these particular countries, you know, try and plot on a timeline various political conflicts, for instance, for Italy or for Egypt, you know, Arab Spring and so on. And then after the fact, try and overlay it with news, and it was quite astonishing how the correlation was. Mm-hmm. And the idea here is, of course, you can track 140, 50 countries easily, right? In real time using a systematic approach from news analytics.
Right. Let's go to my second question, which is, now we all understand how news is used in different ways, and actually more than news. After all, Thanos collects everything. But now let's ask the question about distinguishing, and you made the point about distinguishing signal from noise in terms of news, if you will, real news from entertainment. But now there's another category, which is fake news. And so how is that playing in your analysis, in the data sources, in your vetting of the data sources, and so on? So let's start with Thanos.
Well, actually, I have to tell you honestly, I don't really care about fake news.
Okay.
I believe that the recipients of our indicators or insights have to use common sense to work out whether it's fake or not. And I believe there's a lot of talk today about fake news, which kind of reminds me of Orson Welles' movie F for Fake, where it really was a problem of the specialists. And it's an issue of whether it's institutionally fake news is acceptable, and the democratization of news is that I'll be concerned, because now anybody can post fake news instead of institutions. And I think that's the real issue. And we spend a lot of time more on relevancy, and to kind of clean the feeds and the data, we do spend a lot of time classifying credibility. But I think it's very hard to do a good job on that, and I state to the clients of our data, common sense, please.
So for credibility, is that a very human-intensive task still?
No, we're using actually classifiers. We're
Okay.
doing machine learning. And it's something in keeping with what Sarah said earlier in the previous panel. You've got to use common sense here. The final reader has to be able to be educated enough to read through whether it's a hoax or not. And there has to be due diligence done by somebody acting on an insight.
So there's still a human in the loop.
Yes, of course, yeah, at the moment. Yeah.
Did you want to say anything?
Yes. For us, I guess the fake news focus was never there because we are always trying to distinguish between information that clearly if you can get ahead of that information, you want to go with it and you will profit from this early entry point. And let's say news or sentiment or fake news or anything else that is something that the market might believe in but is not information at the end, and then we know that the price will revert back to the fundamental. And so in the quest of trying to distinguish between the two, there are different tools that you can try to use. For example, if you are looking at CEO conference call transcripts, you typically don't look at the portion of the text that were prepared before the call because they are very highly curated, and you are trying to extract information from the Q&A because that's where the CEO and the CFO can reveal useful information. And then a little bit on a parallel with the presentation about fake news that we had before, we use linguistic devices to understand whether the CFOs or the CEOs talk with the analyst is credible or not. And so, for example, the type of English language that's being used is very revealing about whether the prospects, the economic prospects that are being laid out for the company are actually realistic or not. Another example that is in the same vein is information sources. Clearly, conference calls are a very good source of company-specific information. We look at investor blogs as places in which it's very unlikely that privileged information will come out. And it could be sentiment, but sometimes it could be just rumors that are not substantiated by subsequent information. And so if you're looking at that, again, it's not fake news literally, but this is price-moving investor chatter activities that are actually very likely to revert. And these are important part of our investment process, especially in non-developed market countries. And then maybe a last consideration about machine versus human. In our process, we basically invest in hundreds and hundreds of stocks. So in some sense, we don't have the luxury of looking at all these sources of information and distinguishing between information and non-information events. And so it's really back to the machine, but at the same time, our referee is our stock returns. So at the end, we are investors, and so systematically we test our theories, and if they work out, then we see them played out in stock returns. If they don't, then we know that something in our process is not right.
Very good.
For us, fake news is not a big deal either. I can understand it's a big deal for media outlets because it's something to do with their integrity and reputation and so on. But as soon as the information or the news is out there, our job as news analytics providers is to represent the information flow available, and then investors may decide to trade on it or not. But of course, it has impacted how people will react to information, especially if you go to something like social media, where there's probably going to be more fake news than you will see through the what we tend to call the premium newswire services. And I definitely won't recommend people to event trade off Twitter, right? So there the risk is just too high. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, often if you want to trade on Twitter, there can be many different approaches to Twitter, but generally you would probably go more for like the wisdom of the crowd and try to wait for some sort of trend forming behind a story before you would trade it. But here I would say, you know, when you have these fake news stories, you still, you know, you could still benefit from waiting and say, okay, I might get it a little later, but I have that journalist verified for me.
I think what you're saying, and I'm not surprised to hear this, is when finances are at a premium, then you're going to use reliable news sources, and perhaps less reliable news sources is just an enhancement of a trend or an understanding, because you can't risk your investments or your clients' investments because we're talking about financial consequences.
There's definitely, you know, people will go in and try and figure out what is the reputation of a particular source, and they may tailor the strategy that they use for that. And one of the things that I often laugh about when I read it in the news, to myself at least, is when you see, you know, Twitter broke something first, right? Because often what you forget in that kind of thing is that, well, what about all the false positives, right? To get there. So it could be, you know, you have the fake news from Twitter, but you also have the true news, and you have to balance that kind of thing, you know, between you don't know necessarily which is which. So you need that confidence behind it to build up first, and then in fact the journalists might get it sooner, because they before that kind of the crowd comes behind a story, the journalists would already have gone in and manually verified it and put it through a newswire.
One reason, and I will let you speak, but one reason I bring this up is before I joined Columbia University, I was running Microsoft Research, and Microsoft has a search engine, just like Google, and people forget that. And of course, there's a lot of information contained in search queries and browsing history, and lots of information that all of us actually provide these big companies. And so many of you are probably familiar with the flu trends, and people were able to predict where the flu started cropping up just by what people were typing into the Google search bar. And so this is like common now. This is just you know, now. So one could say, well, this is good signal. But perhaps the risk, you know, if you get the flu, you get the flu, and most people will get over it. But the risk is not like losing your money or some safety critical kind of risk if you're not using that signal. On the other hand, I also know that there are ways in which one can use social media, Twitter, and other kinds of browsing history and search queries specifically for market prediction. So I'm kind of curious to know, you know, we'll get to your answer about fake news, but plant that idea in your head. I'd be curious to know your response to that. So, fake news.
So fake news, fake news has presented for us a bit more of a challenge than for the rest of the group.
Because of the political implications.
Because of the political implications. And so again, let's say we've already talked about fake news in elections earlier this morning, but in this hypothetical, right, in us trying to understand elections, not just in being able to forecast them, but also really understanding what the social contract is between voters and public officials, and how that contract can then influence the election cycle and the business cycle, etc. So we've gone back and forth of, okay, first we have to figure out when there's fake news. And in the election case, sometimes it can be bot activity, right? So fake users participating in the electoral debate. And that, of course, is tricky. And once we've figured out how much of the public discourse is fake, then we have to figure out what to do with that, right? How to interpret it. Because on the one hand, bots don't go and vote on election day, but on the other hand, they're part of a debate. And as we know, there are a number of political science theories, voting theories, that are based on name recognition, and the idea that a citizen is exposed to news about a particular candidate. So we've kind of gone back and forth on this, and I think perhaps, and the solution has not been systematic, if I'm frank. In some cases, it's really dependent on the election, for example, and how we factor that into analysis. And perhaps a more productive take on how we deal with fake news has been trying to extract signal out of it. So we started thinking, okay, what can bots, for example, tell us about the organizational capacity of a campaign, sort of the machine behind a particular candidate and how that might influence events? And I'm really glad you brought the Ukraine-Russia example, because we've tried to think about that in fake news and that prism. We looked at fake accounts interfering in the Ukraine debate stemming from Russia, as well as fake news Russian that were planted in Ukraine. And if you look at that, you actually see activity that is before the crisis. So potentially, and again, we have yet to figure out how you can make that forward-looking, but you could try and leverage fake news as some kind of a signal, especially when it comes to political events.
Did you have anything to say about Brexit?
Yeah, that's a different topic. we didn't.
Analyze?
Yes, we did, but that we didn't use. We used a different methodology to do that. We relied on polls and expert opinions rather than news and social media, etc.
But that's another information source. When I think about all the information sources, it's not just necessarily social media and news and search histories, but polls and surveys are also part of this. Okay, so by the way, do the panelists have anything to ask of each other or comment on each other's comments?
Yes, I'm really curious about, in the political field, how much of the noise is generated by the big boys, and what percentage of it is truly groundswell. And I'll explain why I asked this question, because some time before, I used to work in a social media startup, and what I noticed was during the Arab Spring, the time when most of the activity was happening was not happening during the normal day in Egypt. It was happening during the daytime in the US. So I was always curious if the sources were truly coming out of these countries, A, and B, how does it actually even work? Because I've been in Egypt a lot. I've spent many years in Egypt. And one thing I know is it's difficult often to get a good connection with your phone, even in Cairo on Tahrir Square.
Well, I think that brings me to an earlier comment that I made, but I didn't really elaborate that. We usually, for a lot of our forecasts, we really try to triangulate. So again, sticking with the example of social media and elections, we wouldn't look at just one social media channel, and we wouldn't look at just one type of data, right? So we might look at Twitter and other channels, and within Twitter, obviously, we would look at different activities, networks that are being activated, as well as text. So really trying to get as robust of a signal. And then we take the social media analysis and pair that with opinion polls and country surveys, etc. And oftentimes we don't use it as a crystal ball, right? We don't take it as, well, this is what the signal is telling us. Instead, we pose hypotheses for it, right? So let's take geotagging. We might ask, well, we know that Le Pen's supporters are weak in the Northwest. Are we seeing an increasing amount of support for her in that particular region, which should then tell us something about the election, right? So I think we're trying not to be naive in how we use, and to, again, be careful to not take the noise. And again, we really try to, the sourcing, right? When we look at data, we try to make sure that it's data that is specific to the locale. And that, again, to your comment, we, again, think about, okay, are there offline sorts of data that we can use that can help us verify?
I have one last question for the panel. I'll try to keep this short, and I'd like you to keep your answer short, and then we'll go to the audience, and that is, being the technologist here, I'm very curious to know if you are using, you know, fairly advanced machine learning techniques, including deep learning, in your building of the classifier or the prediction engine. So that's a short yes and or no. And if no, why not? And if yes, what kind of success have you had? Tana?
Well, we're using deep learning. Our success is so-so. It's probably better than other systems we've used, tried before.
Okay. And that's on text?
Actually,
everything.
we do text and we do imagery. Imagery is very important for us.
Yeah.
Is a yes for us as well. And in terms of success, it really depends on the application. The data needs to be very, very rich. And if it's, in many cases, that's not the case. And so you basically don't even...
Where is it rich enough for you?
When you use high-frequency data, for example, for long-time series, images would be another case, and the other extreme is macro, where clearly this is not a non-starter.
Good, thank you.
I will say yes as well, but we haven't commercialized on it. We use various techniques because each technique have their own advantages. So anything like your traditional bag of words kind of techniques still work at 10, 15 years in. We also use various base classifiers. We also use, to a very strong extent, various heuristics, and trying to use machine learning to make those heuristics more flexible as well. And especially as you work with more structured content like premium newswire services and so on, heuristics is very, very strong. But yeah, a mix of things. That's the best approach.
Good.
I would say.
Thank you.
Not in-house, but again, we are working on partners who bring some of that expertise.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was just, I was very curious. Okay, let's open it up to questions from the audience. And I like Charles's technique. We'll take 3 or 4, and then the panelists can answer whichever or however many they want. So let's start with you,
Great,
Harry.
thanks. The question I have is, you all mentioned that you use these sort of textual data in your decision-making processes. Can you comment on what fraction of your decision ultimately comes from this source versus other sources, and how, like, just the magnitude of this data in your decision-making process?
Question back there, in the middle.
Thank you. I wondered if you could tie some of what you're talking about here with data and even your fake news comments into Bob Schiller's comments about history and trade wars, except economic warfare. There's so many geopolitical people out here. I'd love to hear your thoughts about data informing economic warfare, which in Europe is like raised to a high art of 500 years ago, except in the ghostly world of digital today. So the stuff the ECB is doing. Love to hear your thoughts.
And back there's a question.
I'm wondering, so David McLean gave an overview about how academics are not able to agree on whether all the strategies that we found are pure data mining or there's actually something. So if academics are not able to agree on this, then how can a fund tell whether the strategies that they found are like data mining or not?
Does anyone want to? Oh, one more question here, and then any one of us can start.
Yeah, there was this reference to the whole idea that, you know, the type of queries and the size of queries about flu were an indicator. So in this case of single name company news, is the activity or the metadata or the scale of activity an indicator of either it being a sentiment or a leading indicator of a rumor? That was question one. And the other question was, you'd referred to, this was, I think, Alessandro was referring to sentiment versus rumors. How do you distinguish between the two? Because to me, like, both would look very similar if I was to do analytics on it. Thank you.
Let's actually start with the how much is data from text. How much is the decision making is coming from?
From text or?
From text, right?
Well,
yeah.
I would say it's largely ignored.
Largely ignored, did you say?
Yes, I'm sorry. What can I say? But that's what I would say. It's usually looked at after the fact.
Where's all your signal coming from?
we're getting lots of signals, but it's mostly ignored by the business. There's definitely a disconnect from the trading floor and the analytics part of the bank. There's a complete disconnect.
Do you have a different answer?
Yes, completely different, I guess. So it's hard to give a percentage. If I can say big data, machine learning, and text all together, I would say that 70% of what we do is that now. How much of this is text is very hard to tell, but I think we even use text now in macro, which is very interesting and tied to the Fed's presentation that we are seeing today. And this is very interesting because the previous approach 10 years ago were numbers. And if you think about QE nowadays, many people were using, short-term yield that became negative, or Japanese monetary policy. You need text to actually try to make that systematic. So that has become very, very important for us.
For us, being a news analytics provider, yeah, of course, it's close to 100%. But I could see, if I look at the market and our clients, we can definitely see that, having observed the market for over the last 10 years, that there's been a huge change, a huge shift in how people think about data today than they did 10 years ago. Back in the 10 years ago, it was really just a handful of firms that were into this. And those would be your typical, your big famous quantitative assets or hedge funds, right? Quantitative hedge funds. But over the last couple of years, the space has exploded. Everybody that looked to, said, alternative data is kind of like a nice to have, has kind of come to the conclusion now that we have to be in that space. We have to start consuming alternative data. We need to start to look at machine learning and so on more seriously. So you're seeing, the conferences have changed over the last year, especially to be much more about not catering for the quants and finding new data sets, but catering for how do we move discretionary to investors into alternative data.
Very nice. Thank you.
For us, it is, we don't use it systematically, but when we do use it, it's incorporated in par with some of the other techniques. So it could be up to 50% or 30% if there were one or two other methods.
Do any of you want to answer any of the other questions? There was one on economic warfare.
I would say generally those type of things are very, very hard when you go to solve, because it's so targeted, and often you don't know what you look for beforehand. And of course, as investors and as a news analytics provider, especially, we are very afraid of adding terms that just pop up and are very around the time. So right now, for instance, we don't track Brexit or we don't track Grexit or something like that, because it's too targeted towards what's just happening now in the vocabulary. So we would look at it much more generically. So it's very hard systematically to kind of dig into something so specific in terms of use case.
You probably have a different answer.
Yeah, we target a lot of those as such, but again, we just look at the political side of these events and debates. And your question reminded me of something broader that, again, we are very much paying attention to now, which is we're seeing something like a new Cold War in the tech space, right? It seems to us that there is a geo-economic fight between China and the US, and it's all about data and AI development and standards around those. And it's a fight about who's going to emerge and then define the economy going forward. So again, it's very much on the forefront of what we are tracking.
What are you seeing?
Well, again, for the moment, it's a big risk for us, right? And it's a risk especially for emerging markets, right? It's not just about US-China relationships. It's about these other countries that will have to take a side. So for them again, it poses a number of political and economic risks.
I just wanted to add to that. I think, you know, for these type of things, having that human overlay to it is almost necessary. You can use a systematic approach to kind of highlight that something is going on, but then if you want to dig into these very specific cases, you need that human overlay still. The technology is not there yet for you to completely rely on what the data produces.
There's an interesting book called The Economic Hitman by Stelios Gouliogou, and I think this is like a new weapon of putting immense pressure on the leaders of small nations to buckle down and agree to certain things by larger nations by using social media and the news, and the social media especially by managing to influence within those countries the populations. And so I see it as, yes, a new method, global warfare, maybe also global control or global influence is just as important.
Did you want to?
I wanted to try to understand the data, to answer to the question, data mining and fundamental versus rumors. And I think for the problems that are, say, deep learning type of problems, so very highly intensive in terms of data, we can't really distinguish between whether the insight that we are picking up is information or not, and how do we defend ourselves from data mining. We basically rely on the machine learning textbook tools that you can use for that. But then there is a big part of what we do which is not so intensive machine learning, and in that case what we always need to have is some economic theory behind what we are trying to test. And clearly if we are thinking about the queries on flu and now we are transposing that idea on queries on say consumer activity, the mechanism that we have in mind is that this is going to be, say, a leading indicator on consumer confidence, for example, and this needs to go through for us to believe that idea. And so there is always an ancillary or a theory that needs to be tested, and this is very useful when something breaks down, because you can try to understand whether it's the market that is not pricing this idea anymore, or is it this ancillary channel that broke down. And if that's this ancillary channel that broke down, that means that your tool is not effective anymore.
Did you want to say
Yeah,
something?
I just wanted to add to also that rumor versus sentiment thing. And I think there are two completely different dimensions, because I could say, I've heard that Apple will buy Facebook, and I think it will be good for Apple. Or I could say, I think it will be bad for Apple. It's a rumor, but there's either positive or negative sentiment associated with it. So for us, rumors would be just another event, and then we would measure sentiment around it. But we would try and differentiate between rumors versus facts.
There was a question back there. You had your hand up? Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I got two questions. One was for Vassili, was regarding the disconnect between your group and the trading floor. I was interested to hear more about that. The second question I had was for all of you, was regarding when you collect the data, it's done by machines, but what's the process that you use to actually extract the insights from it? You know, I imagine it's as a team, but I think it's probably similar to what journalism does in terms of when there's a story, how do we talk about the story, how we address it, and how do we prioritize things? So these are my two questions.
Okay, let's answer that first one that's directed to you.
So basically, I think it's a cultural thing. I think still on the floor at RBC, CM, the generation are not yet the generation who are totally imbued in social media and do not quite believe that any indicators coming out of that will, either they're scared to look at any indicators, or they don't have the bandwidth to manage it, or they don't want to believe in it. Now, this is a disconnect I think will fade away. And I approached, let's put it this way, we started looking at this in 2014, and the projects have been always put on ice or put on a second slow burner. And there's another thing is, this bank will not want to use this for any kind of alcohol trading, not that we're allowed to do it, so forth and so on. So, you know, once you're not a machine, you're a human, you have the resistance, and at the moment I think it's still cultural or social, I'm not sure which.
What about, okay, let's get another question. So that was your question.
I think there's also a question about how we process the news. Everything what we do is completely systematic, so it takes us about 200-300 milliseconds to analyze news, so there's no human intervention as soon as the system has been, can you say, put in production. Of course, there will be humans involved in deciding on rules that we might apply and so on, but everything is automated. And the first things we do is looking for entities. So are we able to detect an entity that we track? And if not, we would completely ignore the story. But if we are able to detect an entity, we will start to look for other things like what's the relevancy of that entity within the article. Are they taking part in an event? So something that will fall into one of the events that we track. How novel is this content? Have we seen this particular event before, or is it the first time that we have seen it across the various sources that we track? We would then start to look at, you know, can we find some temporal analytics? So are they referring to dates? You know, is it an earnings call that is being organized for or next week? Then we would inform our clients of that. Or is it, you know, the earnings? Is it related to? Is it year-on-year earnings? Is it quarter-on-quarter, and so on? And then we'll also measure sentiment. But all of it is happening, can you say, in parallel and automatically.
And I think that's probably true for all of you. You're doing you get a lot of data. You use these automated techniques to extract information from the data. And then I think your question is, well, what is the storytelling around the information that you've extracted? And now you bring in some human expertise and judgment into saying, well, let's look at year to year, earnings, what the source of data is, and so on. Does that help? Okay. One last question here.
Both Thanos and Alessandro mentioned using machine learning to analyze images. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that. What types of images and sources of images have the most meaning or are most relevant to investors and traders and can serve as a signal?
Good question.
All right, I'll start with the fact is that we scan paste bin. I don't know if you know what that is. And we are scanning things that could compromise the bank. And we are scanning images because things that often can be compromised are put on images since they're harder to pick up. And we're looking for things like that in images at this moment. That's as far as we got on the images. The other thing is it's a side project. We're actually looking for wallet numbers as well in images. And the thing is, we have started also a project on lying, because images lie. And that was brought up by Edward Tufte, I think in the late 80s. He brought up the lie factor. And we're trying to implement some sort of lie factor to see if graphs are lying to us or not, and other images presented by companies in their statements and so forth and so on. But that's just really side experiment.
Interesting.
And for us, I guess, I have an aspirational answer that is images of CEOs talking about their company, and there are techniques to extract from those. Is kind of a polygraph, if you like, approach, which is a bit scary.
There's a lot of research in looking at people's gestures and facial expressions to understand, well, deception or truth and so on.
Yes. So, and that, as I said, is aspiration in the sense that the infrastructure to move from text to audio to video is a big ask. And then something that we do that is image related is satellite images, and that tends to work especially in emerging market countries where alternative sources of information are not as good as in developed markets. And so you would, for example, we have estimates of China PMIs from satellite images of metallic index in different Chinese provinces. And the third, which is not really image related, but it's there are some data sets that are so complex in terms of dimensionalities that it is convenient to treat them as an image, or at least to use techniques that were developed for analyzing images to treat that data, even if it's completely unrelated to images.
Can I ask you a question? Are you using Chernoff faces, for instance?
For the first one?
For the multi-dimensional data?
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense. And we also have talked about, but we're not using them, but we know companies who do supply information based on satellite images on shipping, to, especially for commodities. But we haven't started.
I'd like to, I know I run out of time, but I'd like to, first of all, thank the panelists and thank the audience. I would like to suggest to the organizers of this conference to think about news and finance, think about news as broadly all kinds of news, not just news articles from the mainstream media, but also all, everything from text to audio to video, and news that could be from social media, Twitter, and so on, because it's really about information. And all sorts of information might have some implications in terms of financial consequences. So thank you very much.